Hi class. We have taken a look here at the first couple of steps here in the survey research process. So we took a look at identifying information needs, and then we talked a lot about sampling design here. What we want to look at next here is questionnaire design. So I'm going to jump down a few pages here to right there, D13. And we're taking a look then at the design of questionnaires. Now, one thing to note about this is something which we can come up with some general principles about, and we'll talk about this. But really, the main work that we're going to do here is to take a look at some specific questionnaires and tear them apart. And then, more importantly, when you get into your particular project, you're going to spend a lot of time here coming up with a good questionnaire, and it'll be a back and forth between you and me and you and your client. So let's take a look at step 3. Researchers tend to spend about half of their time on coming up with a good questionnaire design, and then they send it out into the field, they collect the data. If they've been doing this for a long period of time, they have then some statistical programs that they can just punch the data in, and it spits out the answers and so on, and they write up the results. So let's take a look at questionnaire design here then. And it says, even the most sophisticated sample design will result in poor results if the survey instrument, that's the questionnaire itself, is poorly constructed. That whole garbage in, garbage out principle there. So there's a number of different things that we're going to take a look at. It says at the end of this unit, there's actually not 9 questionnaires. I've changed that. There's only 4 questionnaires that we're going to take a look at. They start on page D24, and I'm going to ask you to take a look at them and tear them apart there, each of them. We'll do some of that as a group, but we'll do most of that actually in together after you've looked at this as homework, and then we'll get together and we'll go through it in our synchronous class here then. So it won't be in this section as much, but there are a few things that I want to talk about here. As you go through each of these questionnaires here, and let me just take you to one here first. So let's see, we're on page D13, so we want to go about 11 pages here. So down here, let's take a look at this one. So the first one that we'll take a look at here is the Business Admin 111 Personal Data Survey. And this is a survey that I actually used many years ago as an example of a bad questionnaire. And so we're going to tear that apart. And then there's another one here. This one's even worse in many ways, a library user questionnaire. And I want you to tear this one apart and talk about how can we fix this up. And then finally there's the soup questionnaire down here, and the same kind of thing here. There is a revised soup questionnaire. There's still a few things here that we could clean up about this one, but I'd like you to take a look at that one as well. So we're going to go back here to, what page was that on? Well, it was back here a ways. Okay. So as you go through those 4 there, here's some things I want you to consider as you do that. So take a look at the introduction and the closing of each one. You should have a really good introduction before you get into any of the questions. And that'll be an important thing that we look at when we are talking as a class here. What are the components that we have for a good introduction and a good closing? I want you to give that some thought. We're going to take that up in class here. Then take a look at the questionnaires in terms of the general sequencing and their functional layout here. So does it flow well, and so on. When you're doing your particular survey, you probably have your main research questions. And so you'll have maybe customer satisfaction questions, and ask all those ones together, and then jump into the awareness questions. And then at the very end, you should have the demographic questions and so on. What I'll often find is that students initially start by just kind of dumping questions. So you put them all down, and you'll find actually that there's one that I'll say, hey, this would actually be better up here with these questions. So the actual sequencing of the questions makes a difference there. And we'll take a look at that as we go through your own questionnaire. Take a look at the instructions for each question in terms of check all that apply, or check one only, or rank the top three, or branches, right? If no, go to, and so on like that. The types of questions, including the scaling techniques. I don't know why there's a, oh, that's number 5. I guess I forgot a hard return there. The wording of the questions. So take a look at those instrument biases, which we looked at earlier. And then the demographics. So what are the questions that you're going to ask here that are used for categorization purposes? So things like the person's gender and the person's age and so on. And what I'd like you to do then is to list out what those might be here. And then we'll also talk about, well, how do you actually ask those kind of questions there? Okay, most of them are straightforward, but there's some that require some questions. Couple things I want you to remember about this is, first of all, don't ask a question if it's not needed. So when you're talking to your client, you'll ask them, do you want to know the person's gender? Do you want to know their age? What else do you want to know in terms of that? And they might say, yeah, let's put in all that kind of stuff. And then what you want to do is you want to say, what will we use gender for? Like, what do you want to compare it against? What question? So they might say, well, I want to check that out in terms of satisfaction, in terms of customer service. Are we treating our women customers different than our men customers? So we look at that and say, okay, that's good. So that's a test that we can do. And so we should be asking gender. On the other hand, if they've got income, and you say, well, what would you use this for? What would you want to compare it against? And if they just say, well, I'm just kind of interested in that, then it's probably best just to leave it out there. Unless they really have some use for that, it's useful information for them, then don't ask it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the demographic questions should be at the end. So what many people do is they have the demographic questions at the very beginning. The only reason you should have demographic questions at the beginning is if you're using them to branch people or to figure out if they're part of the survey population. So if you are talking to somebody and they need to be at least 16 years old, and you come up with to a group of teenagers, then the first thing you probably want to ask them then is, you say, hi, my name is Doug, and I'm a student at blah, 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 and we're doing this particular survey for this reason, blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. This is actually only for people who are 16 years of age or over. So can I ask, are you at least 16? Or what is your age, you could say, okay? What age category do you fall into? And so you can use that to find out if they are part of the population. You would also use that, as I mentioned, for branching. And so as you go through, let's say it's a DSB survey, and so then you want to jump into a few questions which are specific to the BBA students, the ones in the 3rd and 4th year. And so you would ask that question at that point. Are you a BBA student, or what program are you in, or something? And then that branches you to some specific questions. Otherwise, all of the demographic questions should be at the end. And so typically what we would do is we would ask all the main questions, the research questions, and then we would say these last few questions are used for classification purposes only. And feel free to not answer a question if you feel uncomfortable answering that. And then you ask them their gender and their age and their income and things like that. And the reason why you put them at the end is because it helps people to feel more anonymous. If you ask demographic questions at the beginning, then you've actually found out something about them that they feel less anonymous. Now, having said that, that is for an anonymous survey. If it is a survey where you need to know their name or some other identifying information, then you should tell them that right at the very beginning then, and say, we'll need to know your name for this. Maybe it's because you need to follow up with them or something like that. And we'll talk actually in class about what those examples are. You can still ask the question, their name at the very end. That's fine, but they need to know at the beginning that you will be requiring their name. So we will take a look at some examples of that in class. In terms of looks and general appeal, you want to take a look at the format of the thing and how neat it is and all that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at some sensitive questions. And so occasionally you need to ask some questions of a really sensitive nature. And, how do you do that? So suppose we want to ask this question here. Have you ever shoplifted anything? Yes or no? The problem with that, of course, is it's like you've thrown a bucket of cold water over the person. It's like, where did this come from? And it can be a shock to them. Of course, there can be obviously a bias, a response bias on their behalf, because they want to give the socially acceptable answer and so on. So there can be a bias there. So how do you actually do that? Well, I like to think of it like a swimming pool. And so thinking of, I guess, the bucket of cold water is one thing you could do with a swimming pool is to dive right in, but it might be really cold. And so the best thing to do is to put your toe in and then maybe your foot, and so you get into it slowly if it's the least bit cold, right? That's what we're going to do, is we're going to get people used to the water. So here's a revision here. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with general and impersonal and move to the more specific personal. As you know, there is now a great deal of discussion about shoplifting in this community and questions about how it could be handled. Some people think feel it's a serious problem and something should be done. Others that it's not a serious problem. How about yourself? Do you think that shoplifting is a serious, moderate, slight, or no problem at all in our community? So here you're dipping their toe in the water. You're telling them that you're talking about shoplifting. At this point, it's very general and it's impersonal. There's no threat to them. Next question, similar. Okay, so in the last few years, do you think shoplifting increased, stayed about the same, decreased? Again, pretty impersonal and so on. Now we're going to get a little more personal, a little closer to them. Try to recall a time when you were a teenager. Do you recall personally knowing anyone who took something from a store without paying for it? Now, that's getting more personal, but it's still not very threatening, is it? Because it was a few years back, maybe in my case, many years back, and it's also not about me. So it's not really threatening, but it's starting to get personal. How about yourself? Did you ever consider taking anything from a store without paying for it? Well, that's not a crime, right? Did you actually take it? So you see what happened is that we moved them in. Now, they could still lie and so on, but you're getting them comfortable with it. And you've kind of changed the focus to when they were teenagers, got them to think in that. The question doesn't specifically say when you were a teenager, these last couple, So it could be recently, but it does make them feel more comfortable. Now, here's another method. It's called the coin flipping method. I love this one. It's one that you're not likely to use, but there's a couple of things that you need to know about this particular one. Two conditions must occur for this coin flipping method to work. The sample needs to be really large, several hundred people. It doesn't work with 30 people. Okay? And the researcher can't see the result of the coin flip, because that's what you're going to ask the interviewee, the respondent, to do. Is they're going to flip a coin, and depending on whether they get a head or a tail, they're going to answer a particular way. All right? So, and you can't see the result of that. That's really important. Now, that's not a problem in terms of, say, doing it over the phone or something like that, or email, I guess, but is a problem if it's face to face. So you've got to actually turn away and let them flip the coin. The interviewer gives the following instructions here. So I'm going to give you a coin to toss, or you could ask them to grab one if it's over the phone or something. When you toss a coin, don't tell me whether it's a head or a tail turns up. Instead, please answer yes or no according to these instructions. Answer yes if you have ever shoplifted or you got a tail. Answer no if you've never shoplifted and you got a tail. The or and the and are really important here in terms of how this works. Now, let me show you how this thing works. Let's say we've got 500 people. 1,000 people. That's going to be our sample size is 1,000 here. And if you took a look at this, you would expect then that about 500 of them should get heads and about 500 of them should get tails. Now, if you're off by a bit, like 485 or something versus 515, that's not really a problem. That's why we need big numbers here. It doesn't work with just 30 because it's easy to get, like, say, a 20-10 split. But when you talk in, say, 1,000 people, then you're going to have the heads and tails even out pretty close to the 500. So a 50-50 kind of thing. Now, let's say in reality, we've got people who have shoplifted and then people who have not shoplifted. And maybe it's something like this. Maybe it's something like 10% have shoplifted and 90% haven't. So that's the kind of thing that we would expect here then. By the way, the number of people who shoplifted is actually higher than that. But anyways, let's say it is a 10%, 90% split here. Take a look at what we expect here. First of all, we're going to use the whole concept of independence here. And I know that's unit I, but you've seen that before in your first stats course when we talked about probability. What that means here is that shoplifters don't have a greater propensity towards heads or tails than non-shoplifters do, right? They're the same in terms of flipping the coins. So what we would expect here then is a 50-50 split of this 100. So in other words, we would expect this 100 to have a 50-50 split just like we had a 50-50 split over here. And the same with the 900. We would expect a 450-450. Now, again, the numbers will probably be off a little bit in terms of that. But those are the numbers that we would expect because we know that these two variables are independent of each other. Shoplifters don't have a greater propensity to flipping heads than tails. Then what we do is we say, answer yes if you have ever shoplifted. So that would be all the yeses if they've shoplifted, so all of these people. Or you got ahead. And answer no if you've never shoplifted and you got a tail. So it's just the one cell here. The number of shoplifters is equal to the number of yeses, which in this case then would be 550 minus the number of no's right there. Isn't that cool? Anyways, that's how that works, but you got to have people follow these directions exactly. They shouldn't tell you whether they got a head or a tail. They should answer just yes or no, and these conditions have to apply there. But that's how that works.